very much for joining us today. My name is Dieter Wanger. I am the Associate Provost for Global Strategies and International Affairs here at the Ohio State University. We are grateful for the assistance of the Columbus Council on World Affairs, the Thompson Library, and the Center for Latin American Studies to have brought us together today to hear from Mexico's former leader, Dr. Ernesto Zedillo, who over the past 12 years has become a leader and a champion of globalization efforts. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Zedillo, who has served his country as President of the United Mexican States from 1994 to 2000, coming to this exalted position from a career in academia and politics, including as the Secretary of Education of Mexico. His background and current occupation are truly academic. He has a PhD from Yale University. He has been teaching, among other institutes, at the prestigious El Colegio de Mexico, and now at Yale. He has recently been invited as an international member of the American Philosophical Society also. Dr. Zedillo has been honored for his outstanding contributions with honorary degrees from Yale, Harvard, University of Miami, and UMass at Amherst. Other honors include the Gold Insignium of the Council of the Americas and the Tribuna Americana Award of the Casa de America in Madrid. In continuation of the political aspects of his career and combining them with the academic endeavors, Dr. Zedillo prepared and co-authored pace-setting studies and reports on globalization and the public policy questions, including his participation in the Global Development Network, the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, the G30, and countless other organizations dedicated to aiding the global community. He also edited 2 books in 2008, Global Warming, Looking Beyond Kyoto, and The Future of Globalization, Explorations in Light of Recent Turbulence. The breadth and scope of his work, thinking and writing regarding developing nations, international relations, and global economies is truly inspiring. He joins us today as the Frederick Eisenman 74 Director of the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization. Please help me welcome our distinguished guest, Dr. Ernesto Zedillo.
Thank you, Provost Warner, for that generous introduction. I am very pleased to be for the first time, and I hope not for the last time, at this great university and at this incredible facility that already is arising some envy. It's wonderful and beautiful, and I know how great this institution has been traditionally for its students and its faculty, and the great contributions that in many fields have stemmed from this house of higher learning. So I'm very thankful to be here today. Well, it was my turn to speak about Latin America early in the day. So when I was invited to come here, said, what do you want to talk about? I said, well, not about Latin America, because I would have dealt with it early in the day. And what I thought that it would be perhaps an interesting topic for you was to deal with the broader question of global governance. My real motivation today has to do with the fact that in a few weeks, the so-called G20 at the leaders level will be meeting in Mexico. As you know, the G20 came together, I would say, as a consequence of the great financial crisis that erupted in the fall of 2008. It has met several times already, and now it's a turn for the group to meet in Mexico. So I thought that it would be timely to go a little bit back in time and speak about, well, why do we have these efforts of global coordination, what relationship do they have with the phenomenon of globalization, and how these attempts are doing, particularly in light of the enormous challenges in front of us. And let me start by recalling that already in the mid-1990s, the last decade of the last century, there were some scholars that were arguing that our contemporary globalization had already surpassed, at least by some indicators, the previous golden era of globalization, which really comprised the second half of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century. And those scholars were pointing out that it was surprising that our globalization, our contemporary globalization, was not proving, at least until then, dramatically contentious. Because they recall that the previous great era of globalization had proved contentious and eventually had ended up rather abruptly, with the beginning of the end, the First World War, and the definite end of that era during the Great Depression and subsequent events. And they advanced the hypothesis that our globalization was not proving yet that contentious, because after all, the international community had provided itself a number of multilateral institutions, particularly after the Second World War. And those institutions had provided a modicum of international coordination and global governance that was needed to confront the challenges and problems stemming from our contemporary globalization. However, they said, we anticipate that these efforts will not be enough. Rather sooner than later, leaders, governments, societies will have to come into terms with the fact that if you want to have this so intense and extensive economic integration, then you will have to do more in terms of international coordination, in terms of what is known as global economic governance. Well, a few years after these scholars, which were Aiken Green, Bordo, Irwin, were saying this, probably leaders should have known that after all there was some substance in that claim. Because in 94, 95, Mexico, my own country, went through the first financial crisis in an emerging market, Mexico. Then we saw what happened in Asia with the crisis in countries like Thailand and Indonesia, and that was spread all the way up to Korea. We saw the collapse of the Russian economy, 98, strong capital reversal, and then Brazil, and then Argentina, right at the beginning of this century. So it is not surprising that particularly as a consequence of the Asian crisis, governments reacted and said, oh, we need to do something. They created the G20 of finance ministers and central bank governors, and they said, we are going to create a new international financial architecture to empower the international community to moderate the downsides of this globalization and try to optimize the upsides of this globalization. That was a very nice statement in the late 90s. Then, in the year 2000, we had the so-called Millennium Summit, and this was already after the failure of the ministerial meeting of the WTO in Seattle, Washington, which took place, I guess, in November, December of 1999. So in September of 2000, leaders come to New York, to the United Nations, to the Millennium Summit. And their declaration, you know, is a very, I would say, enlightened on paper, and say, well, you know, globalization is good, but we need to do something about international coordination, international cooperation, and there's a beautiful statement of purpose, you know, coming together and enhance, reinforce, empower multilateral institutions to provide for that kind of governance. And I know that well because I was part of that group. The story didn't stop there. The following year, and remarkably after 9/11, in Doha, Qatar, the 9th round of trade liberalization was launched, the Doha round, and furthermore, in March of 2002, leaders went to Monterrey, Mexico, and adopted the so-called Monterrey Consensus, where again they established all these commitments about coordinating better and to strengthen the multilateral system. By then, of course, China, and this also happened at Doha, had become a full member of the WTO. And as this was happening, actually globalization was intensifying. The phenomenon of unbundling or fragmentation of production processes as a way to accelerate productivity, industrialization, and insertion into global markets had become the way to do it. And this was, in a way, something revolutionary. The same way that we can think of the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century, early 19th century, as something that, thanks to Newtonian physics, allowed tapping new sources of energy and producing machinery, which process that allow us to separate production and consumption. And well, in the 20th century, we had quantum physics and the laser, the microchip, and all that allow us modern telecommunications and enormous computing capacity that added to the legacy of the Industrial Revolution in terms of transportation, have permitted this fragmentation of production processes, which have meant that developing countries like China, and certainly Mexico and many others, have moved very quickly into industrialization without having the need to create clusters, enormous economies of scale. Today, it is possible to industrialize not by creating a supply chain, but rather simply by inserting into a supply chain. And this has really accelerated industrialization in developing countries, but has also accelerated globalization. And this is really a relatively new phenomenon. So somehow it's paradoxical that as people were saying, well, we need better global economic governance, but really not much was happening on the ground, globalization was accelerating. And we started to see, phenomena that nobody would have predicted not too many years ago. If you go back to the latest, to the last 2 decades of the 20th century, the last 3 decades of the 20th century, the concern always was about the insufficiency of savings in developing countries to have sufficient investment and to have sufficient growth. And there was this idea that capital had to flow from rich countries to poor countries, and that eventually that will generate an economic convergence. That was the economic theory of the time. What we have seen in the 21st century is something very different. We have seen these emerging countries becoming quickly industrialized, becoming massive exporters, and by virtue of very high domestic savings, very quickly becoming to exporters of capital to rich countries, particularly to the United States. And that, in turn, has accelerated financial globalization. In the process, what is happening? In the process, the so-called global macroeconomic imbalances start to develop in a very significant way, and it means that some countries are generating large savings surpluses, while other countries, significantly the United States, are becoming larger and larger deficit countries. For several years, the US was having a current account deficit, that is to say, an excess of national expenditure over national income, current account deficit, that's what it is, basic macroeconomic identity of 6% of GDP. And that, together with the fact of financial globalization and the liberalization, the domestic liberalization of financial systems in many countries, and particularly in this country, started to fuel the disequilibria that eventually led us to the crisis that started really in the summer of 2007 with the subprime problems, and eventually erupted into a massive, for many decades, unprecedented crisis in September of 2008. And the situation was extremely dramatic. I remember I had started to teach a seminar on which I call Debating Globalization, and I remember, that when I woke up on September 15, 2008, and look at the news in my laptop that Lehman Brothers have gone under the water. And that afternoon, when I got together with my students, my class, I have been following the news, and being an expert, for the wrong reasons, on economic crisis, I told my students, watch out, because as in the ABBA's song, and most of you are too young to know who ABBA is, I said, there is something in the air. And we are going to follow this very closely, because I am sensing that we could be very close to a situation of financial panic, which I had lived in Mexico not once, but at least 2 times. And unfortunately, I was right, because as the week advanced, the news were getting very worse. The next day, AIG went under the water, and Friday of that week, we read or we heard that Secretary of the Treasury Paulson and Chairman Bernanke had gone to the White House to ask for the President's green light to go to Congress and ask for a lot of money, because without money they could not guarantee the continuity of the US financial system, and they could not guarantee that the crisis that was evolving there would not spread to other parts of the world with massive, incredible consequences. Well, now we know that the money and the reaction of the Federal Reserve and then other central banks prevented the worst scenario to happen, but to be honest, we are still enduring the consequences of that crisis. And one result of that was to say, okay, yes, now we understand we really need to coordinate, actually. A meeting for the G20, but this time at the leaders level, which was an old proposal. I was one of the endorsers of this idea many, many years ago, but certainly not the first. You know, we were very happy, said, well, at last we are going to have, you know, a group of people representing the largest economies in the world discussing these predicaments posed by contemporary globalization and in the context of the present crisis. And they went to the first meeting in Washington, D.C. in November of 2008. They went to their second meeting in London in April of 2009. And until then, the thing looked exciting and promising, I would say. Exciting and promising because if you go back to the documents generated by the G20 leaders, they were very frank in accepting that lack of coherence and coordination in macroeconomic and financial policies had been at the root of the crisis that we were confronting. And in fact, in London, they made a number of significant commitments towards macroeconomic policy coordination, towards reform of financial systems in a coherent and coordinated way, and of course a very strong commitment both in Washington and then in London about avoiding, not only preventing the erosion of trade protectionism as a result of this crisis, but actually recovering the idea that the Doha round, which had failed for so many years to be concluded, would be concluded because now the leaders, the bosses, were in charge and they were commanding their ministers to sit down and negotiate whatever it took to finish the Doha round. They met later that year in 2009 here in the United States again in Pittsburgh, and the meeting in Pittsburgh brought, I would say, two news, one good and one bad. The good news was that they said we are going to put in place a framework not only to overcome a framework coordination, not only to overcome the crisis for good, but actually to achieve recovery in a balanced and sustained way. And the trick to do that will be an enhanced, reinforced macroeconomic policy coordination. That was the good news. I think that, because that is needed, was needed back then and is still needed. The bad news was that the way in which they inform us that they will carry out that framework for sustained growth was, I would say, not very sound. They announced something which they call the Mutual Assessment Process, the MAP. And when people like myself look at the details of what the MAP was, well, we started to have some questions and some doubts. Because for one thing, they said we will have a sort of peer review of our own macroeconomic policies. And those of us that have been involved, who have been involved in international negotiation, well, we know that it's always very hard to say, you know, I'm doing wrong, I'm going to accept to change my policy. Usually the tendency is to say, actually, you are wrong, and you have to fix your policy. Immediately becomes a zero-sum game. Usually you need an external agent to figure out the diagnosis and to start brokering agreements and compromises among the participants. And when I saw that the G20 had given the IMF a rather secondary role, almost a secretarial role, in this mutual assessment process, I got even more concerned. I said, well, it seems to me that the leaders know and understand the problem, but they are somehow recognizing that they will not be capable of providing the solution for the problem. And unfortunately, events in subsequent months confirmed my worst fears. The so-called mutual assessment process proved over 2010 to be a rather erratic, shallow, superficial process, and furthermore, the various deadlines to fulfill certain specific commitments in the mutual assessment process were not really achieved. If you go back to what leaders said in Pittsburgh that they will have ready for the Toronto meeting, which was the following meeting, and then the Korean meeting, well, practically every commitment was not fulfilled. Things got even more worrisome when they started to water down not only the macroeconomic policy coordination commitments, but even the trade commitments. At the Pittsburgh, leaders were saying, we are committed to do what it takes to conclude the Doha round before 2010 is over, which sounded feasible and necessary. As we move into 2010, the negotiations in Geneva didn't make progress. The various attempts to come to agreements in the key questions that were still pending to address or solve were not really undertaken successfully. And when the leaders came to Korea in November of 2010, it was evident that practically every meaningful target that had been established at the Pittsburgh had been missed. There was some progress, I must say, on financial reform at the beginning. But the commitment to coordinate and be coherent among the different reform attempts started at the beginning to be diluted, and eventually, and that's the situation today, it has become a rather contentious process. There was, of course, the Basel III agreement on capital and liquidity requirements, but much more than that, we don't have. And what we do have are these rather isolated, unilateralist financial reforms, like here in the United States, Dodd-Frank, in Europe, also unilateral, isolated efforts, and so on and so forth. Well, by early 2011, the sense of urgency had reemerged. The situation in the European Monetary Union had become somehow critical because of the situation in Greece, but also in other countries like Portugal and Ireland. And perhaps out of that negative stimulus, the G20 again said, okay, let's get serious and let's try to tighten the MAP process, because we do have a problem, still we do have a problem of macroeconomic policy coordination that, if not addressed, this is going to lead us to serious trouble. And in fact, at that point, it was also evident that the problem of Europe, or the problem of the European Monetary Union, was at its source consistency in some forms of economic integration, the creation not only, of course, of the common market, but the monetary union, in the case of the euro, and the lack of other ingredients, economic and political ingredients that are necessary to validate and make the monetary union sustainable. And this, of course, is a problem of governance. Well, out of that situation, again, they tried to work hard in 2011. In 2011, there was only one program meeting in France, in Cannes, that due to take place in, I think, the early December of last year. I got a bit worried when the host of that meeting started to push very hard for the introduction of other topics into the G20 agenda, something which had already happened before the Korean meeting. And some of us were saying, listen, the G20 has no political legitimacy in its origin. It's a group of self-appointed countries that auto-denominate themselves the steering committee of the global economy. So they don't have political legitimacy. And we need a G20 with political legitimacy. And that can only stem from delivering real agreements that improve the situation on the ground for the global economy. So if you took commitments back in 2008 and 2009, you should make sure that you honor those commitments and prove that you have done it, because otherwise the G20 will have no legitimacy. And rather sooner than later, the G20 will become irrelevant. Well, the Cannes meeting was not really spectacular, to say the least, in terms of achievement. Among other reasons, because the agenda had become very dispersed, but also because towards the meeting, the crisis in Europe had dramatically intensified. If you remember, last summer, a new episode of financial panic in Europe came, linked to Greece, and this was very much sustained up to October, November. So by the time that the leaders got to France, to the G20 meeting, practically the only topic that was in people's mind was whether the European Monetary Union could continue, given the situation in countries like Greece. What we know today is that only thanks to exceptional actions, interventions by the European Central Bank, the collapse of the European Monetary Union has been prevented. But it's not given that those actions, in absence of more radical policy and institutional decisions in Europe, the European Monetary Union will continue to exist. And that, of course, is a very dramatic possibility. I get extremely concerned when I hear, especially in this country, economic analysis that say, well, you know, after all, the European Monetary Union didn't make much economic sense given differences in the member countries. So the best thing that it can happen is that if the monetary union breaks apart. And that is a very probably correct, but very narrow technical analysis, because it is true, the European Monetary Union was not, to begin with, a sound technical decision. It was a political decision that had to be economically well implemented, and wasn't. But it was a fundamental political decision that if it fails, it will have dramatic geopolitical and eventually, or rather sooner, much sooner than later, dramatic economic consequences. Because it's not as easy as to say, let us break the European Monetary Union and let's see what happens. I know what will happen. Of course, those countries that were put out of the monetary union will suffer enormously, probably losses of up to 30–40% of their GDP, because it will be a financial catastrophe. But I would say that the damage will not be limited to those members departing the union, but that eventually others will depart, and eventually we will see currency wars among members of the union, and that eventually would lead to a breakup of the European common market. And then my question is, didn't we learn? Didn't we learn what happened in the first 4 decades of the 20th century? Haven't we learned that lesson? Don't we know why the European common market was created in the first place? It was not an economic decision. It was a political decision. Because we don't want to go to the fragmentation and the nationalisms that cause those horrendous tragedies. And when I extrapolate the frivolity with which we can take that possibility into other scenarios that could take us also to reverse the economic interdependence or the economic integration that we have achieved, I believe for better, some people would say for worse, in our time, I get extremely concerned, because we should not believe those who say that our contemporary globalization is an irreversible phenomenon. Some people, not so strong anymore, like my good friend Tom Friedman some years ago, would say this is here to stay. This is technology-driven. We cannot destroy knowledge, we cannot destroy technology, and therefore this globalization is here to stay. And we had a long discussion for many years on that. Tom and I said, well, actually, Tom, you know, nobody destroyed the knowledge that we had with the Industrial Revolution. Nobody destroyed the knowledge on how to generate electricity, or how to make the engine of internal combustion, or the steamboat, or the diesel boat, or the railroad, or this or that. And yet we were stupid enough to destroy the process of global integration that had been achieved thanks to those technological means. And if we did it before, we could do it this time around in our 21st century. And that will have dramatic consequences, not only for some countries which are more engaged in globalization, but I would say for humanity at large. And in my view, the way to prevent or to make less likely that scenario is, of course, to come into terms with the idea that if we want to have good markets at the local, national, and global level, we need government. And this should be the big debate nowadays. And I'm not talking, believe me, because I don't mess around with your domestic politics. But this should be a debate in the world, where people say, well, you know, there's a contradiction between freedom, economic and political freedom, and government. What are they talking about? The ultimate guarantor of our political freedoms is the state. And we could not possibly have markets that function properly without rule of law. And the rule of law has to be provided by the state. So what are they talking about when they speak of this contradiction between markets and state, markets and government, or governments? We need one if we want the other. And to have the idea that countries will continue to benefit from economic integration without being willing to share their sovereignty in some aspects that are needed to have some sort of international coordination is a terrible mistake. Of course, I'm not proposing that that construction is easy. We have seen so many failures to confirm that it's very hard, because after all, we are talking about the provision of something that we economists technically call global public goods. And delivering these or constructing these global public goods have very serious difficulties. Well, you have to have countries willing to share or even give up some of their sovereignty. You also have the problem of free riding. It's always nice to wait for the other to put the share, and you turn to the other side, you know, and only later you see whether you have something or you are willing to contribute something to the process. So it's terribly difficult to construct the global public goods of financial stability, of open markets, of climate change mitigation, of control of pandemics, and so on and so forth. But if we don't like the effort that is implied in the construction of those public goods, then we better think about the alternative. And the alternative, dear friends, let me tell you, is not nice. Thank you very much.
For an exciting topic and exciting inside view of what was happening. Let me ask Professor Abril-Trio, who will be moderating the discussion. You have graciously agreed to take questions, so
indeed.
Looking forward.
We have 25 minutes for questions.
Thank you. Tremendous review of our history in a few minutes, which I appreciate. If I'm not mistaken, I think our hosts for the G20 meetings oftentimes provide a good deal of leadership in setting the agenda. In recent times, I understand that Mexico has been discussing a lot of financial inclusion. Do you happen to know if Mexico will be pushing that particular issue in the meeting? Secondly, if they do, doesn't that seem like a rather small issue, relatively speaking, compared to what you can refer to? And thirdly, if it were to be pushing that, whether it's Mexico or somebody else, do we really have the protections in place for those people who are going to enter the financial system for the first time and not be taken advantage of in the possible doing so?
Well, I don't work for or with the Mexican government, so I don't know exactly or in any way what they intend to do in this meeting. I do know what you mentioned, that my government has been pushing for this topic of financial inclusion. But I would say that the role of the host is not that important. I think Mexico, the Mexican government will do a fine job. They did a fine job, you remember, with the COP meeting in Cancun after the failure in Copenhagen. But there are limits for the host government to get something productive out of one of these meetings. I think there are other players which have not only the power but also the responsibility to do the right thing. And obviously the US is a key player. If the US doesn't commit strongly to push for one of the important topics, well, hardly anything will happen. If China also looks to the other side of the Europeans, then I think there is no real room for getting any meaningful agreements. So I don't really know what will happen in the Mexican meeting. I think my government will do not 100, but more than 100% to contribute. But that contribution is not enormously decisive. In my opinion, introducing other topics is not good for the process. It is a distraction. In fact, if you think about the three basic topics that came with the G20, which were macroeconomic policy coordination, financial reform, and trade, I would say, okay, you know what, drop two of them. Drop trade, because I think as long as we don't backpedal into cynical protectionism, we have WTO and the dispute settlement instrument to protect what we have now. Financial reform, I think we already have the Financial Stability Board and the Basel Agreement on banking supervision. We have a long tradition of collaboration among central banks. So I think financial reform eventually will be more or less okay. And if it is not, we're going to have another nice crisis, and that will make people go and do what it takes to do well. But without macroeconomic policy coordination, I think we are in deep trouble, in very deep trouble. And of the three, it must be the most difficult one. And if we don't do it, then I think it's very problematic. So I would put my effort, my last unit of political capital into macroeconomic policy coordination and will not be distracted by other issues.
Any more questions? Yes.
I think from what you said that you feel that in the European crisis that the way we must go is stronger and deeper governance and integration in Europe. So what does that imply?
In how many years?
Quickly, I would think.
No, I would say what I would love to see, well, I will not see it, but probably my children or my grandchildren. I would like to see the United States of Europe. I would like to see a great power emerging in Europe out of this project, which has been going on since the 1950s. Well, short term, what do we need? Well, we need, a transparent lender of last resort. Because so far we have got this implicit and rather random lender of last resort, which is the European Central Bank. We need a much enhanced fiscal coordination than the one we have. We need some national governments and the bigger members of the union to accept that they will have to inject capital into many European banks. Without those three things, I think we will not see the light at the end of the tunnel.
So I take it from your talk that it seems to me that you only accept the fact that globalization is really, it's happening, you cannot really reverse it.
No, I didn't say that. On the contrary, I am very hysterical about this idea that globalization is happening and nothing. No, globalization can be destroyed in a few weeks.
I guess that's, I was referring to Latin America, where there's governments that maybe they are not very much in favor of globalization, others that are, and they see the benefits of it. And some arguments are made that if you enter a globalized economy in your country, open your markets, and I assume you have to have something to offer, to sell, as well as to buy things. Is the process the problem? How a country, depending on the level of development they have, how do they insert themselves in the global markets so they can survive and so they can not have their whatever little industry they have destroyed or taken advantage by much bigger corporations that have more technology? Is there a process you think each country should have, depending on the level of the economy they have? How they go into a globalized world?
Well, what you described probably was right some or many years ago. That's really the way in which 19th century and early 20th century or 20th century industrialization was all about. Today is very different. A few months ago, when I was reading one paper by Richard Baldwin on this new industrialization, consequences of IT, I recall a conversation that I had with Jiang Zemin, then president of China, many years ago. Was president of Mexico, was president of China. And he said to me, you know, I once spent a month and a half in Mexico. And I was a younger man. I said, whereabouts in Mexico? No, I went from Matamoros, Mexico to Tijuana, Mexico, you know, from the Gulf to the Pacific, visiting every city along the border which had maquiladoras. Deng Xiaoping asked me to do that. It's very interesting, you know. And actually, at the time, I just, you know, said, well, this is very nice, you know, that they came to see that. When I see what the Chinese have done, I realized that they actually had two models. One Singapore and the other was Mexico. Because they were able to see what was happening in Mexico. That you could have suddenly significant creation of industrial jobs without really having the whole technology or even the capital to industrialize. And the Chinese were very clever. They said, you know, this is the trick. We don't need to create these incredible clusters, these incredible economies of scale. If I produce only one part for every TV in the world, that will be a big step towards industrialization. But of course, if I want to do that, I need to open my border so that I can import the components that I'm going to need to produce that little part for a TV, right? And that is a new model. When you look at the complexity of supply chains, and you look at these rather old ideas that you have to have your own instruments and you cannot industrialize unless you have big scale or big market, well, I think, well, that is wrong. I was in a Rolls-Royce factory in England 2 months ago and was watching, and I know you have a factory like that here in this city. And I went there and I looked at this incredible turbine, one of the new airplanes. And I asked, you know, how many suppliers do you have to produce this turbine? He said, well, 120 different suppliers. From how many countries? More than 40 countries. And that, I think, it's so shocking. Because that factory used to produce everything that was needed for that turbine. And now you have components from all over the world. So I think we need to change the idea of how countries go about industrializing. I also get worried when in this country people repeat, oh, we need to go back to the romantic times of Detroit or whatever. I mean, that's impossible. That's non-economic. That would be silly.
Any other question? Yes, please.
I'm concerned about our workers. Industrialization is such a very, very, very slow process, and it's essential for employment. I know people are left at home very agricultural endeavors, and you cannot employ the masses of it who create it. How do you have any suggestions for Africa? Enter into the globalization process.
I think Africa is coming into globalization in the last few years. In some good ways and in some bad ways too. But I think that to the extent that African countries improve their infrastructure, which I think they are doing it, you will see increasing industrial activity in African countries for several reasons. Well, they have, or they will have the labor force to do it. They are beginning also to develop domestic markets, and actually they are beginning to develop the financial system. And with modern technology, in Africa you see banks that you don't see in other parts of the world, banks that are managed through a cell phone. You know, a lot of financial operations and movements occur in Africa because they don't have the traditional banking infrastructure, but they are discovering the new way of doing banking, even before that it is done in countries like my own country and like the United States. They are going through a good moment, which is partly explained by the emergence of the Chinas of this world. Commodity prices have been fine for Africa and Latin America, or most of Latin America over the last few years. And in those countries that have some modicum of political stability, we are seeing very impressive rates of economic growth. When you look at projections of what may happen in the global economy in 20 or 40 years, African countries, large African countries, are there. So I'm no longer as pessimistic as I was 10 years ago about Africa. I am beginning to be, extremely hopeful and optimistic that we are, if not within the very next few years, I would say within the next 20 years, Africa will hit a tipping point, and it will be one of the engines of economic growth in the world. The demographics will help a lot.
I do have a question, actually.
Don't be shy, Professor.
No. I do have a question, and we discussed in class with the students. I know you are retired from politics and you don't want to mess up with the current politicians. But anyway, suppose.
I never suppose.
Suppose you were.
I am a two-handed economist, not a one-handed.
Suppose you were the president of Mexico now. What would you do to fix the problem, the war with the narco traffic?
No. I can give you an answer as a professor, but never putting
Okay.
myself in the position
Okay,
of...
okay, because then I can...
No. Yeah, because remember, you know, what Oscar Wilde said about advice. You
Uh-huh.
remember that? You know, it's always bad to give advice. It is fatal to give good advice. Okay, so you better be careful. No, I think I am on the public domain about my, well, it's not my ideas, but what I have studied and live about the problem of drugs. And what I and others have said, based on the evidence, is that the so-called war on drugs has been a total failure. The present criminal approach, I would say, to control the supply and the consumption of drugs has failed. And now we have half a century of evidence to say that. The problem is not getting better. I'm against the consumption of drugs, and I think it's a mistake for people to use drugs. But if you are concerned about the problem, the way not to do it is the way we have been doing it all these decades. And what I and others, and I have been fortunately in good company, we have said is that the drug problem must be seen first and foremost as a public health problem, as a medical problem. Addictions are diseases, and you must look at addictions as that, as a medical problem, not as a criminal problem. You must also be careful of thinking about human rights when you deal with this problem. And of course, economically, it's very important that whatever you do, you have a clear objective of undermining massively the revenues that drug traffickers obtain from the illicit trade. If you put together those three principles, then I think you will have a very different approach to the one that we have been following all these years. When I was in government, I was still hopeful that, spending more and doing more, we will be, if never fully successful, we will, keep pushing in the right direction. Now I am totally convinced that we are getting nowhere, and therefore we should start debating more seriously a different approach for dealing with this issue.
But that would be a global solution.
Well, that would be a coordinated solution. Certainly, it's again an example because drug trafficking is a multinational, it's a global, problem. So it is very hard to do it right in one country and not doing it right in other countries. But I think we don't need to have a totally global solution if we had a good regional solution. And if the US and the Latin American countries and Canada could have more coordination towards more sensible policies, then I think we could make significant progress.
Yes.
In your talk, you spoke a lot about the political and economic aspects of globalization. And with globalization, it's often associated with the spread of American ideals. So can you talk a little bit about the societal or cultural ramifications of globalization?
Well, again, I'm not so sure that globalization is only about the spread of American ideals. That's a very US-centric idea of the world. You would be surprised how much influence the culture of other countries has in this country, because this country is very open, actually, right? And many things that Americans see as their own culture is actually universal culture. that has been assimilated in this country. So it's true, you know, when there is more commerce, when there is more investment, you know, some countries' culture influence other countries' culture. But the question is that bad? I cannot imagine my adolescence without the Beatles. And I never stopped liking mariachi music, believe me. No. I mean, I like the two or the many musics, you know. So I never really understand this defensiveness about, you know, cultural aspects of globalization. I think the more open you are, the greater the possibility to be enriched by the culture of other countries. And I think the best example is the United States. Mm-hmm. So I think it's an important issue. It is happening, but it should not be an argument to slow or stop globalization.
Yes.
Yeah, I welcome your words about the relation between states and the rule of law, and I only wish that the right people hear those and take those to heart. And I also welcome what you have to say about the sharing, the necessity of sharing of sovereignty and issues of coordination. I think you very justly raised the issue of legitimacy and how those issues of international coordination are to be legitimized, particularly on national levels, where precisely the question of in whose interest those kinds of arrangements are has become a topic of some contestation. So can you talk more about what's needed to legitimate those kinds of agreements and those kinds of emergence of governance institutions?
Yes. As I suggested, well, you have to legitimize it in the case of the G20 with results. You know, if you get the global economy to fix its ills and to grow again, then governments can say, you know, this coordination is good. But if they continue to say one thing and do another and deliver very bad results, people are going to say, well, why are you doing it? This makes no sense. So I think that's one aspect specific about the predicament confronted by the G20. And then there is a much bigger question, which you raised, okay, if we are going to share sovereignty, or we are going to be part of these international endeavors, what is for my people in it, right? And I think this is the very fundamental problem for several reasons. Number one, because in many or in most economic phenomena, there is always winners and losers. And you have to take the political decision of when, where, and how compensate or alleviate the pain that the losers of the process, of the outcomes of the market processes are having. And sometimes we simply ignore this problem. You know, sometimes it justifies, you know, okay, I open the market and an old inefficient industry is wiped out. Well, I don't care about the owner of the factory, but maybe you should care about the workers of that factory, you know, because it's not as simple as to simply say they are gone and they are gone. So you have to have something in your political system to address that issue, and more frequently than not, that is not the case. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that there is a stark inconsistency between the political domestic speech that politicians practice to attract a vote and the realities of globalization. Even in this country, you know, what is very popular? Well, to take China as the whipping boy. Every problem, listened to recently, would be traced back to China as it was 25 years ago to Japan. Say, oh, we have lost industry because of the Chinese. Well, politicians know that that is not true. And they should find ways to communicate better with people and tell people, you know, we cannot have it both ways. We cannot have societies like ours with this incredible technological change without having competition, domestic and international competition. Because competition is what has driven this incredible technological change in industry, in service, everywhere. So we must be always alert that if we want these good consequences, we will have to deal as society with at least some of the bad consequences. But we tend to have a rather bipolar discourse. And that is terrible because that guides and provides a very bad civic education to people. So I think that we have a problem with our political systems. We haven't yet internalized the consequences of globalization, not only in the speech, but also in policies, in practical policies.
Thank you, thank you, thank you very much.
As a symbolic gesture of our appreciation and the memory of Ohio State.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for.
Thank you.